You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. It's the decision of a generation for Scotland as Thursday sees its residents go to the polls when they decide whether to vote for independence. The economic and political implications have been pored over extensively and will continue to do so this week, and it is indeed expected to be a close-run thing. Question marks do remain over what kind of currency there will be, how the economy would be run, what kind of Scottish foreign policy there would be. Other independence movements from around the world are keeping a close eye on Scotland, from Catalonia to Corsica, as this could set a significant precedent. There was a velvet divorce between the Czech Republic and Slovakia back in 1993. That was driven more from above. However, Scotland's independence battle is seen as more of a grassroots one. But should Scotland vote yes, and what will the political landscape look like? Well, to discuss this and some of the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined by Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk. Also here is Michael Gardner, Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. He's also author of The Constitution of English Literature. And Jan Fedemuk is here, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance at Brunel University. He's author of the report, The Stability of Monetary Unions, Lessons from the Breakup of Czechoslovakia. And Jan, I'll turn to you first, taking the lessons of what happened in the so-called velvet divorce. I mean, can you see any kind of similarities between, say, the Scottish arguments for independence being played out and the ones that were made in the former Czechoslovakia 20 years ago?
Right. I think there are certain similarities. There are also differences, important differences. As you said, it was more top-down process in former Czechoslovakia, whereby there was no referendum as such. Rather, it was a result of elections and the peculiar political situation, or the political or constitutional, rather, setup in Czechoslovakia, whereby the two governments, the government of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, had to agree on forming a federal government. And that doesn't really apply in this case. There's no such condition in the UK. So that was a difference. The similarities, the main similarity, I would say, is the fact that economics was an important factor. It is an important factor in Scotland, where one of the motives for independence is their ability to keep the revenue from North Sea oil. In Czechoslovakia, it was more about the economic reform which was taking place at the time, which had very asymmetric implications for the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Slovakia was a lot harder hit by unemployment, by the recession that ensued. And they wanted to proceed more cautiously in terms of implementing the reforms, which Czechs were not that keen about. And so there was this kind of disagreement on economic policy.
But Slovakia is prospering more than the Czech Republic now, isn't it? Has it overtaken the Czech Republic?
It has caught up. It depends which kind of statistics you look at. As of the last year or two, it has come very close in terms of GDP per capita. But it's still, by and large, people are still poorer. There's differences in terms of Slovakia has received a lot of foreign investment. And so there's this kind of contribution of to the GDP by foreign companies, which doesn't necessarily, it's good for the economy, but the profits from that do not necessarily accrue to Slovaks themselves and so on.
Well, how much of it was a break from the past? I mean, throwing off the shackles of communist rule or being a communist country, and do you see any similarities in those emotional arguments being made, say, in Scotland, throwing off the yoke of what was once the vestiges of the British Empire or whatever? I mean, was it leaving aside the economic arguments, which a lot of people in Scotland can't actually answer, just the emotional pull of being independent? I mean, that's strong. That was strong, wasn't it?
It was. The communist factor was important in the sense that under the communist regime, it was an authoritarian regime. Basically, everything was party. And so while there was some latent nationalism in Slovakia, it was not out in the open. And people who would endorse nationalist views or who would express nationalist views would potentially be sanctioned by the political regime at the time. Now, democracy has changed this. There was essentially complete freedom of speech by 1992. There was very broad representation by a wide range of political parties, and some of them were more nationalistic than others. And so this issue, the issue of whether Slovakia should be part of a relatively highly centralized Czechoslovak federation, whether it should be something more akin to a confederation or whether it should be completely independent, that came out into the open. And it was possible to discuss it. The breakup of Czechoslovakia was indirectly an outcome of that. But again, the economic situation at the time was quite important.
And no regrets 20 years on from anyone?
I think most people have accepted it, and it was probably inevitable. I lived there at the time, and I wasn't particularly happy myself that the country disappeared. But ultimately, it probably was for the better in the sense that whenever you have a diverse union or a union of two diverse groups, ethnic groups or nations, there is always a potential for conflict. We've seen this in Czechoslovakia. We've seen it very prominently in former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union. We see it in Ukraine now, Belgium, Spain. And whenever there's a potential for political conflict between different ethnic groups, if you compound that with economic problems or any sort of other aggravation, then it can become a kind of more important, or it can come to the foreground more than otherwise. So it is something that would have surfaced at some point or another anyway, and this way, at least this kind of conflict has been eliminated.
Do you see it, Michael, as a matter of conflict? I mean, how much of this argument being played out is really about giving Westminster a good kicking? Scotland hasn't been listened to for so long, and this is a chance for it to be listened to.
I think that's right to an extent. That's one way of putting it. But a couple of things that I'd add is that, firstly, I don't see this as specifically a Scottish process. I see it as a referendum about the British Constitution that it so happens can only be answered by one part of the United Kingdom. But it does concern the makeup of the UK. It's always been a question for the whole United Kingdom. And another thing about the question that you asked Jan about the Czech top-down working of the Velvet Divorce, which, as I understand it, was actually against most of the wishes of the people. I think what's happening here is something like the opposite of a top-down process. It's about a principle of sovereignty. It's about the possibility of regaining unmediated populist sovereignty of the people over the absolute sovereignty of Parliament. As it happens, the constitutional tradition since the 1950s has stressed that the absolute sovereignty of Parliament doesn't actually pertain in Scotland. This is just a way of really clarifying that. And however much you try and personalise it or partify it to be about Alex Salmond or the SNP, it does boil down to the possibility of the sovereignty of the people. That's how I see the question.
Ian, David Cameron has finally emerged north of the border. He's obviously seen himself as a bit of a toxic aspect to the debate. I mean, he's been noticeable by his absence, but he's been forced to go there with the other party leaders. I mean, what do you make of his desperate kind of emotional plea? And how emotional did you feel that it was? I mean, one report said that he was on the verge of tears. I didn't quite catch that myself. But I
didn't really get that, although everybody sort of went with that idea. And that came, I think, a lot from journalists who were there at the time. I was watching it on TV, and it does seem that there was a different account of it from the people that were right there in front of him. I think the reason he's, on the verge of tears, and I don't doubt his emotional investment for a second, is because this is the kind of thing that puts you in the history books. Before, even to his greatest supporters, you would say Cameron looked like a footnote in British political history. Now, he's not going to be a footnote at all. He's going to be one of the most disastrous prime ministers this country has ever had. Because under his watch, the country will...
He would be the Prime Minister that lost the Union.
He'll be the Prime Minister that lost the Union. And potentially, if he manages to stay in power after 2015, he would then go into a referendum where we would be out of the EU. And you would see this period, I mean, looking at it from the historical perspective, an extraordinary shrinking of the British role in the world. So I think, to be honest, he's probably mostly affected by himself. I mean, in terms of the actual Tory party, it does quite well by separation. I mean, typically, it's only 2 elections, really, since 1945 that would have been changed if you have Labour MPs there. But I would strongly suggest that the one that's about to take place would be one of those. Because if Ed Miliband wins, he's probably not going to win with enough space to lose his Scottish MPs. So the Tory party actually tends to do quite well in it. But David Cameron himself, individually, it's going to be absolutely tragic for him.
So his motives are purely selfish. This could be the end of his political career. This will be his epitaph, along with Chamberlain and as the appeasement Prime Minister and Anthony Eden in the Suez crisis.
I think you could put it in those terms. I don't have access to the inside of his head, and it's quite possible that he's motivated by some quite sort of sentimental, nostalgic ideas of, Britain and all of that. That's perfectly possible. But it seems to me that the thing that will be pressing on his mind most is what it will do to his own reputation.
What about Ed Miliband? Will he have to step down as Labour leader? I mean, what will we see if that happens?
Right, so that's the thing, is he's one of the reasons he's not really going to be calling for David Cameron's head, at least immediately, is because he is equally to blame for what has taken place here. These are Labour voters who are going to be decisive in this referendum. It's because they've lost faith with Labour, because they didn't think Labour stood up for their interests anymore against the privatisation, the austerity programmes of the coalition, but really not just the coalition going all the way back to Thatcher. It's because of that they find themselves in this position now where we're on the verge of losing the referendum. So Ed Miliband is as to blame as David Cameron. In actual fact, when you look at trust levels, Ed Miliband's less trusted in Scotland than David Cameron is. That's how unpopular he is.
Even though they have 40 MPs.
Even though they get in, because the Labour Party itself still has a bit more loyalty, certainly, than he does as an individual.
I mean, Michael, has Ed Miliband going to Scotland and, say, the Labour argument, when it finally did emerge north of the border, has it had any kind of traction?
Something that's become quite obvious over the last year or so is a very dramatic decline in the fortunes of Scottish Labour. They're not trusted in the way that they used to be, in part because ever since Alistair Darling's speech to the Conservative Party conference and moving on from there, they've had to stand elbow to elbow with the rest of Westminster. It's not just that they're seen as all being in it together, but they are part of their role is to defend a historically financial union against the wishes of the people. That's how they're being cast increasingly. The mid 20th century's central Scottish strongholds of Labour really are disappearing. I think that's something we'll see post referendum. So there's only a limited effect that Miliband or any other representative of the Labour Party could have coming north, I think.
Does this mean, though, should there be a yes vote, that we'll be seeing really left-wing governments in Scotland? Because of the economic uncertainty, that left-wing government would have to do some quite right-wing things, I would have thought, especially in terms of austerity measures, and that may not go down that well.
Yeah, I think you'll have a different kind of politics. You'll have a different kind of political parties. Political parties in their present form are really an invention of the Hanoverian Revolution, of the time when the British state was invented, and parties had to create competing narratives for the financial trust. You'll see a different kind of politics with a different kind of constitutional foundation. But you may well be right that you'll see emotionally left-wing governments that occasionally have to do some right-wing things. And as I understand it, that's the general perception of the SNP anyway. But there is, I mean, it's nice you don't assume that Alex Salmond will be the leader of an independent Scottish government, because actually we don't know how that will play out at all, any more than we know who would lead an independent English government.
I mean, I think he's going to have an opportunity, but very quickly in that first year, he's going to have to make some decisions that will absolutely destroy him politically. And he's already shown every indication of doing it. I mean, his only real tax policy is to cut corporation tax below the level that Westminster has it. This man is not, and has never really been, the left-wing saviour that he's made out to be by followers of Scottish independence. I mean, really for a time, he was a sort of a centrist, then a sort of a socialist, then a sort of a social democrat. He's never really cared about anything but separatism. Now he's harnessed these enormous left-wing forces, this youthful grassroots movement. And the first thing he's going to do is he's going to get into a bidding war for investment from overseas, which really means he's going to cut corporation tax. He's probably going to end up having to cut benefits and welfare. It would be remarkable if he didn't. And essentially there's going to be a race to the bottom between Scotland and the rest of the UK on welfare, on incomes, on living standards, and it'll be him that's pushing that through.
Interesting that in the interview to politics.co.uk, he cited, he said that it's silly to suggest the land that produced Adam Smith is incapable of running its economy. And I guess, as you point out, are we going to see the invisible hand guiding Alex Salmond's economic policies? It sounds like what you're saying, that we will.
Absolutely, he will prove to be really quite right-wing. I mean, he won't have any choice but to be right-wing, because he's going to be...
But that's not what perhaps yes voters would want.
Absolutely, it's not what yes voters would want. And he has managed to construct a narrative whereby everything that is disliked in Scotland, and for most of, England and Wales as well, which is austerity, the Conservatives, the privatisation of anything they can get their hands on, is actually all the fault of Britain. Of course, it's nothing really to do with Britain. It's all to do with the Tory party and the madness of privatisation that has gripped the political classes since Margaret Thatcher. Leaving Britain won't do anything to change that. In actual fact, it'll probably put him in a much more precarious position, because he'll be desperate to attract international investment at precisely a time when he's been hamstrung in his economic achievements by the Westminster government.
So a considerable disconnect, Michael, between the emotional argument for independence and those kind of economic details that perhaps people feel haven't been quite explained.
Well, that's quite possible. But we keep returning to this idea that Scottish independence is somehow Alex Salmond's idea, and that post-referendum and post-elections in an independent Scotland, not only will he be the leader, but his personal desires will be what are played out for independent Scotland. Actually, we don't know any of that. I take the point that there are emotional arguments that may contrast with the economic arguments. At the same time, the ability of people to politically determine the events of their country, it's right that that's an emotional argument, and it does bring up an ethical question of whether you want to legislate for people or for markets. But it seems that we always return to the questions of Salmond and kind of market-led national collective.
Interesting, Jan, I suppose that the economic argument for the Czech Republic and Slovakia, that it was a real leap into the unknown for them, what kind of economic ramifications there would be.
Well, not necessarily. The economic policies espoused by the two governments were known. Slovakia was leaning more to the left at the time of the separation, whereas the Czech Republic was very Thatcherite at the time, in the sense that they wanted wide-ranging liberalization, privatization, and very liberal economic policy. So, that is what was expected, and then that is more or less what happened afterwards. Now, the other thing is independence for both countries changed the situation to some extent, in the sense that if you were a representative Czech voter, and it was still the Czech Republic was still part of Czechoslovakia, you had to take that into account. So it was okay to be leaning more to the right, because you would know that would be counterbalanced by the left-wing views in Slovakia and vice versa. So by the same token, it's very well possible that Scotland will be less left-wing and England will be less right-wing or less conservative after the separation than before. Because, again, a representative Scottish voter need not necessarily prefer to have Scotland dominated by SNP and Labour only. They may want to have views similar to those espoused by the Conservative Party, whether represented by that party itself or some other party. They may want to have those represented as well. Similarly, England may become more left-wing, because the political weight of England will not be counterbalanced by the left-wing dominated Scotland anymore after 2016.
I suppose a clearer comparison between the example of the Velvet Divorce and Scotland is what kind of relationship it has on the world stage. And I'm just wondering, after the Velvet Divorce, what kind of treaties were required? Did it require kind of bilateral negotiations all over again? I mean, how did that work out? Did it turn it joining NATO, joining all those organizations, the EU? I mean, that's quite a big process, isn't it? And that all has to start all over again for Scotland.
Well, in the case of Czechoslovakia or the two successor states, it is true all of this had to start anew, in the sense that Czechoslovakia had an accession treaty with the EU, and that essentially became invalid because the subject of that treaty disappeared. And both countries had to sign new treaties. Having said that, by 1993, whatever negotiations have been completed between Czechoslovakia and the EU, they probably haven't made that much progress. I mean, in the end, both countries entered at the same time, more than 10 years later. For a while, it appeared possible that Slovakia would enter at a later stage. There was, for a few years, there was a discussion about a first wave that would include the Czech Republic, but not Slovakia. Now, going back to the Scottish example, in theory, Scotland should apply anew for a membership in the EU. They should apply for membership in NATO. Whether that will be also the case ex post, that is, I think, open to discussion. And it's not in the interest of Scotland or the UK or the rest of the UK to have Scotland outside of the EU outside of the single market, outside of the free mobility of labor that we have in the EU for the next several years.
But it won't be, Ian, it won't be up to Scotland to decide that. That will be up to Brussels to decide.
It will.
That, and Spain will have some very strong opposition to that, I would have
Plus
thought.
a veto. So, I mean, there's plenty of ways in which this could be extremely problematic for Scotland. My guess is that some of that talk of veto may fade away, but you're looking at least 4 years, probably more like 8, until they find themselves anywhere near the position that they want to be. In that time, probably they're not going to be given currency union with the UK. They're probably going to be sort of really hanging in there, using the pound, but without any say. It's really a reduction of sovereignty. I mean, even by the point that you get into the EU, I think also that's a reduction of sovereignty. It's very hard, I think, actually, to make the sovereignty argument in a convincing way, not so much because of the origins of the debate or because of where we are now in the world is more and more about pooling sovereignty and sharing sovereignty. And so really, whichever way you look, that's always the cupboard that you sort of get stuffed into. And that's even, as you say, if they manage to get in there. I think there's plenty of people in Europe that will be keen on preventing that.
What do you make of that, Michael, the sovereignty issue? I take the point that you're making about it's not all about economics, but certainly devolving or at least wanting to be part of the European Union and being controlled by Brussels, but not by Westminster. That's a strange move, isn't it?
I think it helps to remember that Britain is a financial union. It's created as a financial union. It's created for the purposes of commercial empire. If you can then adduce a political sovereignty to that, then that's fine. But it has never, in fact, existed. There hasn't been a British political national collective in any meaningful sense. We can then look back. We can take it back from finance and work it out if we can find that kind of collective. But for example, what no campaigners are saying about British ideals of social justice and so on, what precedes that is an absolutely rational financial union to which any kind of political agency comes secondarily. So this has never been a free choice by any of the 4 nations. It's simply been something into which they're led by kind of market rationality. So it's an odd situation in which you're right to an extent, but actually, as Britons don't have agency in the way that citizens of other nation states would have agency.
I mean, I know that, you make a sort of, I think, a half-true point about the origins of the Union. But actually, what you deny is the way that the Union took on its own political identity in the 300 years that we've had since. And I can talk for people of my persuasion, and not just, but many that come from immigrant families or families that consider themselves immigrant that live in Britain. We associate with Britain. We do not associate particularly strongly with England. England, to us, was a question of heritage. It had sort of a tinge of race to it. It had an idea of purity in it somewhere, and it sounded grotesque, and it sounded like something you wouldn't belong to. Britain didn't. It had mixed identity. It had this idea that you could be one thing and another at the same time, and that you could enjoy both at the same time. It was fluid, and it was open, and it was free. And as soon as we start retreating into these other identities, that does not seem to me to be a retreat from a financial union. It is also a retreat from an idea, a decent idea, which is that we can have these multiple identities, which is that we can have an original multiculturalism. And that's something that we're now about to give up on.
I think you're right to an extent that Britain, what you're describing is a Britain that is all about empire, and then all about the reflux of empire, during which the idea of race has to be reinvented as multiculturalism. But that is an imperial history. The way that you perceive England, that's changed. It's changing very rapidly. You've seen it changing over the last month, and it will continue to change. It will not be tinged with race in that way for long.
Historically, I think probably that there is validity to what you say. But what you're discounting is psychology. We do not, as E.H. Carr said, it isn't just what is simply the case. It is also what people perceive to be the case that becomes reality. And for a very long time now, many, especially on the centre-left, interestingly enough, people in England, but also in Wales and also some in Scotland, have started to perceive of Britain as something that is about multiculturalism, that isn't about empire or financial organisation. It simply isn't. That is our primary identity from very many of us. And it will be taken away, and no good will come from that taken away, and certainly no sort of sense of additional freedom or sovereignty or self-identification.
Multiculturalism is about empire. It's not something that comes in after empire. It's about reinventing those separate categories of races in an inclusive way, because The British form of capitalism has to be absolutely inclusive. It has to be naturally inclusive. That's how the British Constitution works. So those identities, as you call them, identities are really for markets. Those identities have to be reworked in a controllable and manageable way. That's what multiculturalism is.
I mean, I certainly don't agree that it has anything to do with empire whatsoever. It's certainly true, of course, that many of the people who used to be from the British Empire now end up here. But you will find most of the people that believe in the British Empire and that still have that old Tory view actually despise multiculturalism and find it this quite dangerous and pernicious taint on the idea of what a proper British identity is. Multiculturalism is liberals standing there like a good schoolmaster and saying, look, everyone gets to play, but nobody gets to interfere with everybody else, because that's what constitutes a free society.
Just quickly your response, I'll move to Jan.
Yeah, in very large part, British Empire is liberal. It's dynamic. It's about adapting to markets. That is where multiculturalism comes from. It is a liberal reinvention of a liberal empire. I'm not really talking about an old Tory position here.
And Jan, I mean, when the Czech Republic and Slovakia went their separate ways, was there a reinvention of identity, being Czech, being Slovak? I mean, up until that point, you were part of one country.
Not really, because these identities were actually quite firmly established at that point. History of Czechoslovakia as a single state was actually relatively short. It was created in 1918, and it broke up in 1993. So, there was whatever 80 years history.
And it was artificially imposed, some might argue.
To a large extent, yes. Slovakia was part of Hungary for close to a millennium by 1918. And as such, it was culturally quite different. It was a lot more Catholic, a lot more rural and underdeveloped than the Czech Republic. The Czechs were part of Austria for about 300 years prior to independence. And before that, they had their own country.
What about relations since then? Presumably, people from both countries work and live in each other's country. I mean, is there still a kind of fraternity there of a shared past, or have they gone their separate ways?
Yeah, very much so. It also helps that the two languages are very close. Basically, if you speak one, you understand the other, and you will be understood in the other country. Also, after separation, they maintain sort of a small version of the EU single market. There was a customs union. There was a common currency for 6 weeks only, and hopefully the Scottish example, or Scotland will not follow this example. But there was a customs union. There was a single labor market. So ever since the separation, Slovaks and Czechs could work in the other country without any restrictions, without the need to require for a work permit or anything like that. And culturally, there's still a lot of exchange. People read books, people travel, spend holidays in the other country, they watch movies and so on.
Because I'm just wondering, should Scotland vote yes? What kind of recriminations there could be? Have you sensed that it's been a divisive campaign, Michael? Or do you think if yes happens, or even if no happens, back to business, what do you think will happen?
I think it's been divisive to an extent, but those divisions are not necessarily between England and Scotland. Those divisions may well be between people who have never really been politically involved before, but who see things changing on one hand. On the other hand, the political class, that seems to be the division that's emerging. And I see no reasons to imagine Anglo-Scottish recriminations after a yes vote. I imagine that the two peoples will cooperate much better than they have in the past without the interference of the current standing political class.
Ian, interesting about the media coverage. The Herald on Sunday was the only paper that really went in behind independence. Everything else, all the mass circulation tabloids like the Daily Record, were for the no vote. Yet it doesn't seem to have made that much difference. Dead trees don't win votes, it seems. It's all about social media now.
I wouldn't go that far, even as someone who spends most of his days on Twitter. I don't think we've quite reached that point. We definitely have reached a point, I think, now where, the media class is considered almost synonymous with the political class. And really most of the things that we say about Westminster also apply, I think, to most of the newspapers. Funnily enough, polls show not so much online. So I think we're right in that respect. People, and they're quite wrong about this, have more trust in what they read online than what they read in the newspaper. They shouldn't. Believe me, they really, really shouldn't. But nevertheless, they do. So there is proof now that the public are so fed up with Westminster, so fed up, really, I think actually the truth is with London. that they are now almost unaffected by media coverage. This will be very good news, once he's sort of sober enough to recognise it after the emotional effects of what's happening for Ed Miliband, who is trying to talk over the heads of the newspapers to the public on issues that he thinks matters to them. This is absolute proof of that, of the fact that people really aren't listening to the press any more than they are to politicians.
What do you make of the media coverage, Michael? And interesting, Rupert Murdoch was collared the other day. He gave a pretty non-committal answer, and The Sun turns out to say, it's up to you.
Yeah, I think the way that Ian has described that sounds right. It sounds... I do agree, although I hadn't really thought about it in these terms before, but I do agree that people are beginning to disregard a certain kind of London-based commentator, and that's an interesting phenomenon. That is a different kind of collective thinking, and we struggle to put that in party political Westminster type terms. So that is something that will stay after the vote, however it is, and that's a phenomenon we have to think about.
Also, interesting point. Enrico Letta, the Italian Prime Minister, said a vote for Scottish independence could be as damaging for Europe as the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Jan, what do you? It's all. I guess this is the week to have exaggeration and hyperbole. But how kind of seismic do you think a yes vote would be for Britain and for Europe? And he's talking about globally as well.
Yeah, I think this is certainly an exaggeration. It's quite amusing that they should make this kind of parallel. Having said that, it will be important because, like you mentioned at the beginning, there's a number of regions of other countries that are essentially watching the Scottish example very carefully, and they're waiting to see what will happen, not necessarily with respect to the outcome of the vote, but if the vote is for independence, what will happen with respect to other implications, such as the EU membership, such as the negotiations between the two successor states that will emerge after separation, etc. And so if Scotland votes for independence and is given a relatively favourable deal vis-à-vis EU membership, vis-à-vis the continuation of the currency union with the rest of the UK, etc., then this will encourage the Catalans, the Corsicans, the Flemings, and, there are regions in North Italy that might... get rid of the Mezzogiorno and become more separate, more independent themselves. So there will be important implications in that respect.
Interesting. And Ian, I guess whatever happens, Alex Salmond will be a winner because he will get increased powers. Or at least Scotland will get increased powers come Friday if there is a no vote.
Yeah, that's true. But you see, that accepts a discrepancy, that distinction that I just don't accept, which is this idea that the English, somehow trying to stop all this power from going out to the others. See, I think that is an SNP distinction, and it is not real. I think there's always been a push for more power for Scotland. It didn't need all these threats really for a Scottish Parliament to be set up. And when it came time quite clearly to have the referendum that was given by Westminster, I think that actually there's many people, especially on the left, but actually across now all elements, even in Westminster, who would say, look, federalism's really the only game in town. Once you start putting these reforms forwards, yes, David Cameron will fight with his backbenchers, but nevertheless, we're going to start pushing towards rearranging the structure of English democracy, handing more power to Wales. And actually, that kind of idea is on both sides. Salmond's idea is different. It is about putting up walls between us, about separating us. It's about identity politics. And in that, he will lose if it's a no vote.
I know Michael will disagree with that, but just quickly, finally, interesting point also, Martin Boone at ICM says the polls may have been inaccurate. Just taking the polls change from day to day. What do you think will happen on Thursday? Do you think the polls are accurate? Do you think the don't knows will come over to the yes camp? What do you think will happen?
I tend to skip the polls and go straight to the bookmakers' websites if I want to know.
Very wise.
If I want to know how likely something is. But just a couple of things finally. I think that lots of people who are involved with yes campaigning and yes writing are not fans of Alex Salmond. We don't identify with him. Even if he were doing identity politics, what you have is a much more grassroots campaign. And secondly, for me, as someone who doesn't have a vote, actually, despite the accent, I don't have a vote in this. It has always been about the raising to prominence of these sovereignty questions, of questions of political determination. And from that point of view, a couple of months ago, I was thinking this was tremendously successful already. I'll watch what happens tomorrow with interest, but that's not the real kind of determining moment for me.
And Ian, do you think it'll go yes or no?
I think, you know what, I feel like everything I've read, my journalistic instinct says no, but in my guts, I've been feeling yes for about 10 days now, and it scares the hell out of me.
Jan, yes or no, do you think?
I should have looked at Bookie's website.
Put a bet, put a fiver.
My expectation is that it will be very close, but it will be a no, simply because at the last minute people will be concerned about the implications that it will have. But again, one way or another, it will not be. The world will not be the same on Friday, because either it will be independence or it will lead to a renegotiation of the arrangement that we have between Scotland and the rest of the UK, possibly between all the nations of the UK, not only Scotland. So it will change things a lot. My expectation would be that it will not go through.
In any event, a changed political landscape. Well, many thanks. That's Jan Fiedermuck, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance at Brunel University. Also here in the studio, Michael Gardner, Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick, and Ian Dunt, Editor of politics.co.uk. Many thanks for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London. politics.co.uk. Also here is Michael Gardner, Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. He's also author of The Constitution of English Literature. And Jan Fiedermuck is here, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Economics and Finance at Brunel University. He's author of the report The Stability of Monetary Unions, Lessons from the Breakup of Czechoslovakia. And Jan, I'll turn to you first. Taking the lessons of what happened in the so-called Velvet Divorce. I mean, can you see any kind of similarities between, say, the Scottish arguments for independence being played out and the ones that were made in the former Czechoslovakia 20 years ago?
Right. I think there are certain similarities. There are also differences, important differences. As you said, it was more top-down process in former Czechoslovakia, whereby there was no referendum as such. Rather, it was a result of elections and the peculiar political situation, or the political or constitutional, rather, setup.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. It's the decision of a generation for Scotland as Thursday sees its residents go to the polls when they decide whether to vote for independence. The economic and political implications have been pored over extensively and will continue to do so this week, and it is indeed expected to be a close-run thing. Question marks do remain over what kind of currency there will be, how the economy would be run, what kind of Scottish foreign policy there would be. Other independence movements from around the world are keeping a close eye on Scotland, from Catalonia to Corsica, as this could set a significant precedent. There was a velvet divorce between the Czech Republic and Slovakia back in 1993. That was driven more from above. However, Scotland's independence battle is seen as more of a grassroots one. But should Scotland vote yes, and what will the political landscape look like? Well, to discuss this and some of the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined by Ian Dunt, editor of Arguments, which a lot of people in Scotland can't actually answer. Just the emotional pull of being independent. I mean, that's strong. That was strong, wasn't it?
It was. The communist factor was important in the sense that under the communist regime, it was an authoritarian regime. Basically, everything was party. And so while there was some latent nationalism in Slovakia, it was not out in the open. And people who would endorse nationalist views, or who would express nationalist views, would potentially be sanctioned by the political regime at the time. Now, democracy has changed this. There was essentially complete freedom of speech by 1992. There was a very broad representation by a wide range of political parties, and some of them were more nationalistic than others. And so this issue, the issue of whether Slovakia should be part of a relatively highly centralized Czechoslovak federation, whether it should be something more akin to a confederation.
More than the Czech Republic now, isn't it? Has it overtaken the Czech Republic?
It has caught up. It depends which kind of statistics you look at. As of the last year or two, it has come very close in terms of GDP per capita. But it's still, by and large, people are still poorer. There's differences in terms of Slovakia has received a lot of foreign investment. And so there's this kind of contribution of to the GDP by foreign companies, which doesn't necessarily, it's good for the economy, but the profits from that do not necessarily accrue to Slovaks themselves and so on.
Well, how much of it was a break from the past? Throwing off the shackles of communist rule or being a communist country, and do you see any similarities in those emotional arguments being made, say, in Scotland, throwing off the yoke of what was once the vestiges of the British Empire or whatever? Was it leaving aside the economic...
In Czechoslovakia, whereby the two governments, the government of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, had to agree on forming a federal government. And that doesn't really apply in this case. There's no such condition in the UK. So that was a difference. The similarities, the main similarity, I would say, is the fact that economics was an important factor. It is an important factor in Scotland, where one of the motives for independence is their ability to keep the revenue from North Sea oil. In Czechoslovakia, it was more about the economic reform which was taking place at the time, which had very asymmetric implications for the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Slovakia was a lot harder hit by unemployment, by the recession that ensued. And they wanted to proceed more cautiously in terms of implementing the reforms, which Czechs were not that keen about. And so there was this kind of disagreement on economic policy.
But Slovakia is prospering more